So today's lesson is going to be on due process, equal protection, and justice. We want to focus mostly today on the 14th Amendment and see how that applies to the concepts of due process, equal protection, and justice. So by the end of this presentation, you should be able to answer three questions. Number one, what is due process? Number two, what is meant by equal protection under the law? And then finally, how do these two concepts relate to our criminal justice system? All right. So I want to start by going back in time to 1776, the Declaration of Independence, which we covered in class. Thomas Jefferson wrote this document, of course, if you recall, as a way of explaining the purpose and the principles behind our revolution against the British. Now, in that document, not only does he explain the purpose of government, but he makes this interesting comment that all men are created equal when referring to the rights that all men are born with: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But we want to focus on this idea of being created equal. So back then, like I said, he was referring to the fact that all men are born with these God-given or unalienable rights. And part of that is to explain the role of government. Remember, the role of government, the purpose of government is to protect those God-given rights of life, liberty, and what John Locke referred to as property. But Thomas Jefferson used the phrase pursuit of happiness. So at that time, of course, we know that there was slavery in America. So Thomas Jefferson, as a slave owner, most likely was thinking about white property-owning men. Basically, back then, the white property-owning men were the elites in society, those who were typically in charge of the government. So back then, I think it's safe to say that those were the people he was referring to as being equal. Probably not women, probably not African Americans. So we'll talk about, how has that idea of equality changed in America over time as well. So equality back then meant equal opportunity, equality of opportunity, that all men had the same chance to succeed. Not, you look over here on the right-hand side, it does not mean that everyone is going to succeed. Not everyone is going to end up in the same social class or with the same social status, wealth. Those things may or may not be different. So kind of a common theme in American history is the idea of the individual. What role does the individual have in their own success? So if you have equal opportunity for success, then the burden is placed on the individual to do something with that opportunity. So keep that in mind when we talk about equality. All right, fast forward a little bit to the 1800s, the late 1800s, right after the Civil War. We know the Civil War was fought to end slavery. Three amendments were created during this time of Reconstruction. You want to look at those. So the 13th Amendment, as you will recall, basically abolished slavery. 14th Amendment, which we're really going to dive into in this presentation, granted citizenship to those former slaves and said that they should have equal protection under the law, which we will talk about more. And then even beyond that, the 15th Amendment granted those former slaves the right to vote. So let's really focus on this 14th Amendment, because that is the basis for what we want to talk about. So the 14th Amendment can be broken down into three parts. The first part is the beginning quote here: all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So this part of the 14th Amendment we refer to as defining citizenship. It specifically says that if you are a person who was born here in America or you've gone through the naturalization process, you are a citizen. Well, what does it mean to be a citizen? Well, the next part says that if you're a citizen, then no state government shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Okay, and we refer to this as the Due Process Clause. And that word should be familiar, that phrase should be familiar, due process, because it actually is in the Fifth Amendment as well. So the question would be, why would you also put it in the 14th Amendment? Well, you got to go back to the original purpose of the Fifth Amendment. The original purpose, of course, of all of the Bill of Rights was to protect Americans from the federal government. Now, after the Civil War, of course, where you had southern states versus northern states, obviously the idea that not only did you need protection from the federal government, but state governments as well could abuse your rights. So you needed some protections against the states as well. And that's what the 14th Amendment gives us. The fact that it mentions no state or any state. And over time, the Supreme Court has used the 14th Amendment to do what we call incorporating. You see that word there, incorporation. Incorporating the Bill of Rights to apply to the states. So that's what incorporating does. It applies the Bill of Rights and says that state governments must also protect our freedoms and rights in those first 10 amendments. So due process, we'll talk more about due process in a minute. And then finally, the 14th Amendment says that nor, referring to the states, shall deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. So states have to basically do what? Treat people equally. Okay, and you can kind of imagine why they felt the need for this, because after the Civil War, southern states obviously, even though slavery was abolished, they were obviously going to feel some certain way about African Americans. And of course, we will see through the Jim Crow laws, through segregation, they created laws to try and discriminate and segregate society. And the argument would be, well, how can you do that if the 14th Amendment clearly states that you have to have equal protection under the law? So the 14th Amendment basically creates two things here. Creates what we call civil liberties and civil rights. Civil liberties deals with our freedoms. It deals with the Due Process Clause. Civil rights, on the other hand, deals with the Equal Protection Clause. So let's look at that a little bit more specifically. So civil liberties, like I said, you want to focus on the Bill of Rights, all the different rights we have, from the freedom of speech to the right to bear arms, to the right to a jury trial, the right to a lawyer. All of those freedoms and rights in the Bill of Rights can be categorized as life, liberty, and property. So we don't want the government to take those things away from us without a good reason, without proving that we did something wrong, that in which we deserve to have our life, liberty, or even our property taken from us. Okay, that's civil liberties. So when you feel the government is taking away those specific rights from you, that's a due process issue. For example, if you're arrested and your rights are not read to you, well, that's an unlawful arrest, because they can't take your freedom without letting you know why they're taking your freedom. Or the IRS, just can't come by one day and take your car or your house They have to go through a process. They have to, sue you, try to get their money back if you didn't pay your taxes. But they have to prove that you deserve to have your house or your property taken from you. So we call that civil liberties. All right, civil rights, on the other hand, deals with equal protection. And basically what we're talking about here is if you feel that you are not being treated equally, if you feel that you are being discriminated against. So you can think of all the different groups of people throughout American history that have been discriminated against in one way or another. We refer to that as civil rights. So no person should be denied equal protection of the law. The law should treat everyone the same. So comparing the two, once again, civil liberties protects us from the government using the Bill of Rights. The government can't do certain things. It requires the government to follow strict rules and procedures before they take away your life, your liberty, or your property. It protects individuals from government abuses, civil liberties. All right, civil rights, on the other hand, coming from the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, it's what the government should do. So, for example, the government passed a law in 1964 called the Civil Rights Act, which basically banned discrimination and ended the Jim Crow era of segregation. It protects the minority from the majority. So if you think about why minority groups, meaning their numbers are smaller than other groups, if you were thinking about passing laws, well, minority groups can't pass laws on their own because they're always going to be outvoted by the majority. So you need this extra protection so that minority groups are not abused by the larger group of the majority. And that's what civil rights is supposed to do, protect those groups from discrimination, where the majority would create laws that discriminate or harm those smaller groups. And those groups could be not only African Americans, but women. Even though women make up more than half of the country, when you look at smaller environments like the workplace or maybe even a college campus or something where their numbers might be smaller, they face harassment, discrimination, things like that. You think about equal pay, the statistic that women get paid less than men for equal work. That's a civil rights issue. The disabled, the idea that someone who's in a wheelchair might not have access to a building because of their disability. That could be a form of discrimination. And then, of course, the homosexual community, talk about gay marriage. You talk about that recent case where a baker didn't want to bake a cake for a gay wedding. Is that discrimination? Is that a civil rights violation? And of course, we know that the courts play a big role in determining or interpreting, what is discrimination and what isn't discrimination. So hopefully, you have the assignment where you're going to go on the Microsoft Forms and answer. You've got 10 questions to answer about this presentation. So hopefully by now you can go back. What is due process? What do we mean by equal protection? Then how does the criminal justice system, law enforcement, the prison system, all of that is criminal justice system. How do they relate to the idea of due process or equal protection under the law? So those are 3 things to think about. Go answer your questions, and I'll see you next time.